Circle of Hope Network, doing life and being church together.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started here, and this is again a little, what they call in Louisiana, lagniappe, a little something extra. I did have it as part of my initial one. One of the things that we talked about in terms of the competencies for professional chaplaincy is doing research. And by that, we don't mean the kind of research that you did at Andrews when you were doing a research paper in church history. But we're talking about social science kind of research on human subjects. We'll look at some examples of it, but the growing area of professional chaplaincy now is to get chaplains both familiar with the research that's being done in the chaplaincy field, to get chaplains doing research, whether you're doing it as, if you have training, you're the primary investigator, or signing on to somebody. Maybe you have a social worker or somebody at Berman who could be the lead investigator, or University of Manitoba or somewhere else that can be the primary investigator and you can be assisting in it. And for us to see chaplaincy as based upon evidence-based practices. That we do things, because how much of what we do as chaplains is, well, it feels right to us, or we feel we have gifts, or somebody taught us this is the way to do it, or maybe trial and error, we work different ways. But can we do research and see what are effective techniques? And we can't do that unless we're keeping records of what we do, hence charting. So one of the big movements encouraging this has been the transforming chaplaincy movement. Ivan yesterday mentioned Wendy Cadge at Brandeis, C-A-D-G-E, spelled like badge, pronounced like badge, and sociologist, and she wrote this book he mentioned, Paging God. And it's a great analysis of the healthcare chaplaincy profession and some of the tugs of war between different organizations like CPSP and ACPE, and different trends in different parts of the world on spiritual care versus chaplaincy. Because there's also a movement, there's a group called Healthcare Chaplaincy Network that started a spiritual care association, and they think you don't need to be a clergy member to be a chaplain. You don't have to have a graduate degree, that a nurse can be trained in the basic techniques and can do spiritual care just as good as a professional chaplain can. And they're a for-profit network that provides chaplains for specific healthcare institutions, so they've got some money in the game. They wrote to us and said, will you support us? So our letters went back very quickly. No. But
they were asking for financial support?
No, just moral support from a major endorsing agency, affirmation, and we said, nope, we ain't going there. Because of our understanding of chaplaincy as a pastoral specialization. That's essential to the identity. But this is an organization, and it was founded by a Templeton Foundation grant to begin with, between Rush University in Chicago and Brandeis partnered with it. They started out by finding chaplains that they could pay to do a master's in public health. And then they started sponsoring seminars to teach chaplains about research. So they have a chaplaincy research summer institute that's a week long. I did it at Boston University last summer, and we kind of did a literature review, what's some of the key literature that's already out there, hearing from people, chaplains leaders in research. Wendy, not a chaplain, but she's certainly a name. George Fichette, I'll show his name in a minute, at Rush University. He's one of the key folks. There's a number of other folks. So we heard from them and got mentoring, and then we had small groups to talk about, what are issues that we're dealing with as chaplains that we might like to do some research on. How do you form a research question? How do you work with, if you're a healthcare institution or a university, you have to have an institutional review board that approves your research project. Any project involving human subjects has to be approved by an institutional review board. So over the course of the week, we got this immersion in it. So if you're interested in that, that's the way to go. If you want to learn about research, there's two sources that you can look for this kind of academic research. One is Google Scholar, google.scholar.com, and the other is PubMed. Much longer URL at National Institutes for Health, but if you just put in PubMed and Google it, it'll pop up. And what you'll get is something like this. So I searched on PubMed just for Chaplain. How many published articles even mention chaplains? 4,068. First one, the role of the chaplain in the interdisciplinary care of the rehabilitation patient. How do we work together? And that's in the Journal of Rehabilitative Nursing. Documenting presence, a descriptive study of chaplain notes in the intensive care unit in Palliative and Supportive Care Journal. So that's saying, hey, this is what chaplains are actually writing in their notes. Here's some good ones. Here's if these are notes that are going to be helpful for the other members of the care team. Here's really how to do it. Is what that's looking at. Patient appreciation of student chaplain visits during their hospitalization. So what difference does it make if it's the student chaplain, the CPE? We saw that could cause issues in one of our case studies. But sometimes the patients and their families, they don't know the difference. The chaplain's there. And so on. So I just kind of pulled that up as an example. But you could put in suicide in adolescents, suicide in children, suicide African Americans, but Adventist vegan lifestyle. Things will pop up. And studies that have been done on Adventist diet and correlation with different diseases and so on. The folks behind Transforming Chaplaincy went and then also built the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. So Wendy is directing that with Michael Skaggs. And here at chaplaincyinnovation.org has this statement: Chaplaincy, Spiritual Care, Innovation, a Case Statement. Where there they just kind of give a good summary of the overview of professional chaplaincy today. And it's really good reading. And it says, you know, this brings together, and I went to a session they had at the American Academy of Religion meeting this year. So we had campus chaplains, healthcare, we had academics, church history professors, sociologists, all looking at this field. Where are we doing research? What do we need to do? How do we get people collaborating? And so now this is a working group that's part of the American Academy of Religion.
Was this just a recent one?
Yeah, this is just November.
Because I was a member too of the American Academy.
Yeah, this is just the November meeting. And Wendy loves chaplains. I had a barbecue at her house last summer. And so on. So yeah, different studies have focused on specific sectors: healthcare, the military, prisons, rather than comparing and contrasting how chaplains work and are integrated across sectors. Because Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries is unique in that we endorse all areas. Catholics, for instance, have separate healthcare endorsing agencies, and then the Archdiocese for Military Services. The Lutherans have an Office of Federal Chaplaincies, and then the healthcare chaplains. So we're one of the few endorsers that really covers the full gamut. So she's looking at ways, how do we bring all these people together so they get this big overview? And so on. So again, this is the cutting edge stuff. This is where we are today in the latest academic conversations and research. How do we bring research and practice together? Especially the goal is that we're learning from other chaplaincy disciplines and that we're applying what we learn to how we do our ministry. A couple of books that you can look at to get examples. So this is by George Fichette. at Rush University, Evidence-Based Healthcare Chaplaincy, a Research Reader. It has case studies, it has qualitative and cross-sectional and longitudinal quantitative research. You like those words. Randomized clinical trials, the different kinds of research. One of the easiest ones for chaplains to do is the case study. You can take case studies like Ivan presented here and submit that for publication in the Journal of Pastoral Care and Counseling. They love to have things like that. Research literacy is now a requirement for board-certified chaplains in the U.S. and is growing in the U.K. So, as published by UK publisher Jessica Kingsley Publishers, they published lots of stuff on mental health, on chaplaincy with the elderly, with autism, you name it. Just go to the website of Jessica Kingsley Publisher. You'll find all kinds of useful stuff. Another recent book that George Fichette and Steve Nolan did, Case Studies in Spiritual Care, Healthcare Chaplaincy Assessments, Interventions, and Outcomes. So here's a whole selection of case studies that you can study and learn from, and that's also Jessica Kingsley. I happened to be at a chaplaincy meeting when I got a call from one of my Presbyterian pastor friends in Houston, and he was not a chaplain, but he'd been a business executive before going to seminary. And he said, when I was studying for my MBA, we studied by terms of case studies. He says, why don't we do pastoral education that way? I said, well, in something called clinical pastoral education, we do. But he says, what about for pastoral ministry? He says, what if we had a book of case studies of pastoral situations in the congregation? As a tool for pastors to be able to get together, whether we use it in seminary education, whether we use it for groups of pastors to get together and go over and study. So he wants me to be his collaborator on that project. Interestingly, the way he and I got connected was my daughter got married last summer, and our church was kind of small. He's from a big Colombian family, and so we knew there were going to be a lot of people there. And with me having pastored several churches in Houston and all of our college friends and high school friends, we needed something bigger than our little church. So I reached out to a couple of Adventist churches in my community. One wanted $1,500 for me to have my daughter's wedding. I went to a church at the other conference. They wanted $800. They said, I'm getting the pastor's special.
Wow. Nice.
My kids wanted, my daughter had picked a place for the reception. And I looked at a couple of churches near there, and I reached out to this Presbyterian church, and pastor said, hey, let's get together for a cup of coffee. We had a great time getting to know one another. He says, I'm not going to charge you a penny. He says, that's what I see professional courtesy is. He said, when we established this church, this is Presbyterian Church USA, or the more liberal Presbyterian church. He said, we know we're an aging group, and we're not going to be doing dozens of baptisms and church growth that way, but we wanted to be of service to the community. So we don't make an obstacle for couples that want to come and get married. We see that's part of evangelism. And they have, during the week, they have childcare. They have a Christian counseling agency that uses their space. They have a ministry for young adults on the autism spectrum where they come in and can jams and jellies and get some work experience doing that. And he was being coy with me, so I asked his secretary, so how much have you charged the couples that have come? She says, maybe $200 or $300 just because air conditioning is expensive in Texas in August, and we think that's a realistic price for AC and janitorial expenses. And it's like, so I made an appropriate donation and supported that. But yeah, one example of here how he says we could use this kind of learning as pastors, but also a great example of how does a congregation serve the community? How does it see its vision of outreach? So any questions about that? That's it for just kind of touching on the field of research and chaplaincy today.
When do you expect the book to come out?
Well, we have to sit down and start talking about it, and who are we going to get for... It was interesting. He also called me. We were at Oakwood for our chaplains gathering, and President Bush's funeral was happening. And he calls me up, and I'm going into the restaurant where a bunch of us were having lunch. He says, I've been watching this, and there's this chaplain in every scene, this Asian woman Navy chaplain who's leading the procession from the plane, leading the procession into the church. Who is she? I said, I don't know, but within 5 minutes, I will know, because I'm sitting down with my counterpart for the East Coast, Washington Johnson. He's a captain in the Navy Reserve, so he's our first African-American Adventist chaplain to make captain, which is a colonel, equivalent to Army colonel, since Barry Black. So Washington is very well placed. So I walked in, he sat down, I said, so who's the chaplain of the funeral? Oh, that's my good buddy Judy Milana, Japanese-American, head chaplain, command chaplain for Military District of Washington. So I was able to call him up and say, this is who it is, 3 minutes after he asked the question. Washington, by the way, he was also the editor for Message magazine, and his mom was honored at Oakwood a couple of years ago for, she was Bible worker for all the great black evangelists for years and years. So she's like an institution herself. And Washington's wife, Dr. Johnson, Joyce Johnson, is in charge of the distance learning program at Oakwood now. So that's the other member of our team that you're not getting to see here. Very variety of members, as you see. So any questions? Okay, then we get to this issue of suicide, which has really come to dominate my ministry. In my first 10 years as a chaplain, from 86 to 96, I had one young soldier who died by suicide, a young Abenaki Indian of northern Vermont, 24 years old. I had no suicide interventions that I did in those 10 years. Getting back in 2009, it clearly became clear that this was going to be the main thing that I was doing. So I've had 12 soldiers that I knew that died by suicide in the past 10 years. For a while, I had 3 in one unit in 1 week. 2 others in that same brigade that month. I was doing a suicide intervention at least once or twice a month. And that's when I reached out and said, okay, I need some more training, and I became a suicide intervention trainer, and have done a lot of those here and in the Middle East. And from there, got into, just because I knew I needed more information, I started going to psychiatric conferences. Went this year to the American Association of Suicidology. I do suicide trainings for our county mental health agency now, and I'm part of some of these task forces in our community on veteran suicide. So as I said, this has really come to dominate my ministry.
Yeah, I guess it's not a question you can really answer, but maybe a personal thought on it. What do you think, is there hope for a suicidal person?
That's what we're going to talk about. That's the point of the presentation.
But maybe my question is, ones that have committed suicide.
Yeah, we'll talk about that too. We'll talk about that as well. We talk about postvention, care after the fact. Prevention is kind of our general public health awareness. Intervention is what we're doing at that moment. Postvention is what comes afterwards for the survivors. So we'll come to that.
My question maybe is, and again, obviously you don't have to answer, but in your personal opinion,
Yeah.
do they go to heaven?
We'll come to that. Don't get ahead of the game. But it's a subject that's hard to talk about many times, often because these are the questions that we start asking. How many of you remember being taught talking about suicide in seminary, in your pastoral care classes? How much emphasis was given to it? Or how about in your theology classes and ethics classes? But then you come to this case where suddenly you're confronted with the reality. And as pastor, what are you going to preach at that funeral? What are you going to say to the family members? What do you say to yourself? I think of one soldier suicide. He was the S4 NCOIC. That means he's the logistics non-commissioned officer for our brigade. He's a master sergeant. That's E8. So he's been in for 17 years. We were at a hockey game one week. We got tickets. The brigade got some free tickets to go see the Houston Aeros, and his family and mine were the only families that took him up on it. And we were seated in the same row, and we were talking, and I noticed at one of the breaks he was limping as he went up the stairs, and I asked him about it, and he talked about he'd just been given a multiple sclerosis diagnosis. And he had a lot of other pain. He was airborne, so he jumped out of planes. A lot of chronic back pain from all of that, knee pain. And he had his family with him. I had mine. We committed to talking at the next drill, but that never came. This weekend after that, 10 days later, his wife was at a women's retreat at church. His kids were at Grandma and Grandpa's house. He was drinking, and that's when he shot himself. And she came home to find it. He also had, besides the multiple sclerosis, and people in the unit had been noticing it, they'd noticing him losing his balance, and he was a biker, and they were concerned for his ability to ride a motorcycle. But nobody said anything to anybody. He had also been diagnosed with a thyroid tumor. So imagine what that's doing to his whole endocrine system and his judgment. Other people in the unit told me that they knew that he had had prior suicidal thoughts when drinking, and they never said anything to anybody. They figured he got over it. So in that church on that day and in the days afterwards, a lot of anger, a lot of guilt. Chaplain felt a lot of guilt. What could I have said? What could I have done differently? I didn't preach the funeral. We did do a memorial ceremony at the unit. But that was the first one that really hit me hard, just because I'd been so close to the person right before. I was asked to give a presentation about this at the Minnesota conference about 1.5 years ago as part of their ministries convention that they have each fall. And then like the day before, they said, oh, we're having all the adventurer and Pathfinder leaders come. And then it's like, okay, what do I do with suicide prevention and intervention, talking to leaders of primary school-aged children? So I started looking at the research. Just that same day, this headline, lawsuit blames schools for bullying in this 8-year-old suicide. These were U.S. suicides from 1999 to 2015, ages 5 through 9. So as young as 5, and then age 9, that real big spike with boys. Big differential between boys and girls. That's ages 10 to 12 from 1999 to 2015. Over 500 for 12-year-olds, boys. Here's from over a 2-year period, the jump, just 11-year-olds, the dark red, 12-year-olds, the light red. I was going down to Weslaco, Texas, where one of my soldiers died there, and he was one that I taught suicide intervention to about 1 year before. Found out later he had a lot of Adventist family at the Weslaco church, because I went there for Vespers that day after meeting with my soldiers. And he shot himself in the parking lot of the armory, and an armory that Weslaco's the southern tip of Texas. That armory is also the headquarters for the Homeland Security border missions, for drug interdiction missions. So a lot of government agencies working out of there. They know they're being watched by the bad guys. So the commander had said, you better be walking around the parking lot and checking every vehicle twice a day. He was there in his car with the seat down for a week to 10 days before they found him, because they weren't doing their job. They didn't have a chaplain, so I asked my brigade commander, should I go down? They said, oh, there's a chaplain on active duty orders down there. He can do it. Then I got a call from the battalion commander. He said they found another member of the unit who'd hanged himself in a Montana cabin at Christmas. And this was a couple of months later. They just found his body. He said, I need you. My commander says, get down there. I'm getting ready to walk in with the commander and the sergeant major into the room. And I'm told there was a third one, unrelated, a guy who had just retired. There's a statue in front to a Seventh-day Adventist, Harlan Block, who was from Weslaco. He got kicked out of Valley Grande Academy for not ratting on a student, and he was one of the flag raisers on Iwo Jima in the famous picture. He was the local hero. So this soldier died right near his statue. So I had some Adventist tugs at my heart through this. But on my way driving down there, I went through the town of Victoria, Texas. I got a flat tire, and there in the tire shop, the guys were talking about a pair of 10-year-old girls who committed suicide the day before by jumping off of a parking garage. Suicide rate for young adults ages 15 to 24 has tripled since the 1950s. In the past 50 years, that's a 200% increase. 12 people aged 15 to 24 will commit suicide today, 1 every 2 hours. For veterans, it's 20 a day, which comes out to about 130,000 since 9/11, as opposed to 7,000 combat deaths in the same period. Yep. Men commit suicide 4 times as often as women, but women attempt 3 times as often as men. Why do you think that is, that discrepancy? What's that?
It's smarter.
It's the what?
Smarter.
Smart? Well, it's the means. Men are more likely to use firearms. Except among military veterans. Women are just as capable as using firearms as the men are, so the rate gets closer for us.
I don't know whether it's true, but like people who tried to commit suicide, many of them they didn't really mean to die.
Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it also gives them a familiarity with the means, and they're at higher risk for dying. Here you can see the veterans 18 to 29 years over 14 years. Here's the civilians that same age, a pretty stable suicide rate. But here we've seen an increase. So for young veterans 18 to 34, those are the ones at highest risk of suicide today. Compare these numbers. In 2015, there were 44,193 suicides in the United States. 15 times as many as people who died on 9/11. Imagine 15 9/11s. If we had that, how would people respond? 800,000 a year globally, 1 every 40 seconds. Globally, it's the second leading cause of death for young adults after traffic accidents. Another way to think about it, 37,000 people joined the SDA Church in North America in 2015. But 48,000 people died of suicide that year in the US and Canada. So people are more likely to die by suicide than to become a Seventh-day Adventist. Here's a global chart. The darker areas have 15 or more suicides per 100,000. See, North America is about 10 to 14. Brazil and so on is 5 to 10 per 100,000. The light yellow is fewer than 5. So you see the Islamic world through Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, across most of North Africa, one of the lowest places. Russia, India. Now, let me go one more slide. Of course, this presents the US and Canada as pretty monolithic, just one color. But if we go province by province, lowest rate in Ontario, highest rate, so 7.86 per 100,000, highest rate, Nunavut, 71. So Nunavut has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. 113 per 100,000 per males, as opposed to 12 in Ontario. So we have certain populations that are at much higher risk than others. Dave?
Thank you. I know you mentioned that the Muslim world has a lot less suicides. I guess as an interpretation or their spin on it too, because they have, they give their life, but they immediately think they're going to the kingdom or the suicide bombers.
Well,
I'm just wondering where that will stand.
for one, suicide bombers are a very rare reality.
Okay.
And those deaths only happen in countries that are under occupation by foreign powers.
Oh, I see.
You don't see them happening in other countries of the Muslim world. A good book that was recently written just really documents that suicide bombing is an extreme measure that happens in times of foreign occupation, like the Zealots in Palestine in Jesus' time. So let's take that out, and let's also take out the fact that violence is a very small picture, and is everybody practicing in the Muslim world? Some friends of mine in Houston I knew in Kuwait, and they had some good friends who were Kuwaiti citizens. They said, yeah, sometimes the woman wears the niqab, the face veil, just because she hasn't put her makeup on that day. Or girls hooking up with her boyfriend and doesn't want anybody to see, or your hair's not done and you want to run to the grocery store. So there are other reasons other than religion. So I don't have the evidence right now that can look at any of those cultures, but none of it. What do you think could be going on there that would make the suicide rate higher?
Isolation.
Okay, one at a time.
Isolation, loneliness.
Okay.
The cost of living.
Cost of living.
Hopelessness for careers.
Hopelessness for careers, yeah. Yeah, same thing on the Indian reservations in the U.S. Pine Ridge or the Navajo. Alcohol, yeah, high. That comes with the loneliness, the hopelessness.
It's ironical though, in the graph there, you have Africa and other countries, which life is really hard, and yet they have low rate of suicide.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I don't have I'm sure there's data looking at individual countries, and I don't have that right now. But so again, that's just kind of to give you kind of a broad overview of the issue. But we want to look at, more importantly, what can we do? Now, I teach a couple of different trainings that I'll talk about in a minute, but those are both copyrighted. So since we're doing it on video, I didn't want to do those. I don't have the permission to record or broadcast those. But I'm going to use a brief training that the Army does for civilians, but it covers the same principles. And simple acronym here, ACE. Ask, care, escort are the three basic principles. So this is something that in the Army is done for every soldier at least once a year as a review. And I'm giving you just kind of a quick overview. We're going to supplement this when we teach it with soldiers with case studies, with more discussion, some video messages from some Army leaders and so on. But I just kind of pulled out the bare skeletons just to talk about some of the basic principles. One of the things to look at is in individual cases, what are the risk factors that may make the risk of suicide higher for certain individuals? We talked about some things like drug and alcohol abuse, prior suicide attempt, loneliness, failed relationships, family history of suicide. Think of the Hemingway family. Ernest Hemingway and one of his daughters, one of his granddaughters. Suicide went through that family generation after generation after generation. Mood disorders. Not everybody who has a mental illness is suicidal, has thoughts of suicide, but many people do, especially depression, PTSD. Though that's not the driving factor for military and veteran suicides. Half of the veterans who've died by suicide never deployed. Financial stress, employment, we talked about that. So again, even in this case where we're seeing high rates, the factors are ones that are not unusual factors. They're just there in higher percentage. Access to lethal means. So one of the trainings I haven't become a trainer in is called CALM, which is on, how do you counsel on access to lethal means? You're going to tell veterans to get rid of their firearms? In Texas? I mentioned that as a risk, and I had one of my former soldiers call me all sorts of names, some colorful ones, as if I was betraying everything every veteran stood for. But it's like every veteran suicide that I've personally dealt with, 90% of them were firearms. I went to one suicide intervention in the middle of the night. Actually, some of his buddies went to be with him, and I came then in the morning after they'd spent the night with him, but nobody had thought about his firearms, and we were talking about safety. So I said, "Do you have a firearm?" And he reached behind him about 4 feet away and had a .45 automatic pistol. And he took the round out of the chamber and cleared it and handed it to me. So even the other buddies didn't think, hey, what can we do now to, and I said, can I take this for now? Do you have anything else? Can I take this to the unit and we'll hand receipt it to you, just keep it locked up in the armory for a while we get you help? He says, no. He says, I think that would be a good idea. Now, even simple things like how many cases do we see in the news about an 8-year-old who finds dad's loaded gun and kills mom or a sibling? That was just saw a couple yesterday in the newspaper. Simple things like locks, keeping them in safes. So access to lethal means is one of the key issues. Poor social skills, legal problems. Do you see any common threads among those risk factors?
I see hopelessness.
Hopelessness. What else?
Crises.
Crises, yeah.
Just problems. Everyday problems.
Everyday problems.
Everyday problems that come home.
Yeah. Loss is one that I'd say. Loss of relationship, loss of job, loss of meaning, all those things that give you hope and meaning and purpose. So those are the risks, and these are ordinary things. So not everybody who has these has thoughts of suicide, but some people do. On the other hand, there are also protective factors. Strong relationships, whether it's family, friends, groups, the church, available health care, physical and mental, good problem-solving skills, so that when crises hit, you can break it down and work the problem. Belief in a higher power and faith, that can be a strong protective factor, but it can also be a toxic issue if your experience of religion has been very negative. Getting help when needed, knowing that you can go for help, having strong personal and professional values, those are the things that can give us more of that resilience, is the word that we use. And for most people, they're kind of juggling between these two things. You've got the crises, you've got the things that give you help in the crisis, but there are some individuals who are in such pain that suicide looks like hope to them, because it's the end of pain. Any questions about this?
Thank you, and for pointing out the significance of the loss aspect.
Now, and for the suicide interventions that I do, these days for young adults, it's loss of a relationship that is usually the one that comes out the most. Loss of that girl who they thought was their soulmate, that they dated since age 14. He joins the army, and it's usually males in my experience. She goes off to college, life goes on. And often these are young men in homes without a dad. And they've not had any male role models who can talk to them about breakup relationships or how you handle those. Sometimes they're in families where there's a lot of strong women who are constantly criticizing men as worthless, good for nothing. Had one young Filipino soldier who was that situation. Very demanding parents, you've got to get these good grades, you got to have this good job, you got to do this, and don't be that worthless man like your father was, or this, that, and and that was what he was getting. And then his girlfriend leaves him, and that's when he was thinking of suicide. Add the alcohol to it.
I'm thinking of a personal experience roughly 15 years ago at Henderson Highway Church, Junior Division, 12-year-old boy committed suicide.
And those are things that don't just affect the family. Yeah, that soldier of mine, the one that with the multiple sclerosis, he was the most loved soldier in our unit. He was the dad for everybody. He inspired everybody. We had his funeral at a Church of Christ in East Texas. It was filled. The procession from the church to the funeral home went through that town, probably 100 cars in the procession, led by 100 motorcycles of the Patriot Riders. And in that town, every car that we passed pulled over to the side of the road, and the driver got out and stood at respect as the procession went by. That was the impact he had in that small town. Warning signs. Most people will, I'm realizing my power is getting close. Most people will give some kind of sign that they are thinking about it. Some will not. Some are very good at keeping their thoughts very private. And when they die, a lot of shock and surprise. Sometimes you do kind of a psychological autopsy afterwards, and you start hearing things that people did pick up on, things that they never put two and two together. But sometimes it just comes out of the blue. Other times, you start seeing things. And a lot of these things that we've talked about, changes of behavior. So the young Filipino, the guy that I mentioned, his sergeant noticed he shows up, and for the first time she saw him without a haircut. He hadn't shaved. His uniform was not pressed. He was late. That's what caused him to ask, what's going on? And then when I got there, she said, hey, Chaplain, can you talk to this guy? And within 5 minutes, we were talking about suicide. Changes in behavior, dress, appearance, weight changes, like a sign of depression, withdrawal, giving things away. Oh, here, could you take my cat? She's going to need a place to stay when I'm not here. Well, where are you going? Hopelessness, sadness, financial, legal issues, texts, posts. I've been on Facebook for 12 years, starting as a campus minister, and a lot of my suicide interventions with my soldiers are because somebody saw something in a Facebook post. Relationship issues, lots of different things there that are things that stand out. Yeah?
I'm looking at those signs, but I also discovered that sometimes individuals who commit suicide, they are at their happiest moment in life.
Yep. Why?
So there is, and that's what I am yet to discover. Why are they so happy? Because you try to find out what is the underlying cause of this sudden burst of happiness. And they will tell you some exciting things. Only to discover when they are dead that it was just a facade.
I don't think there was.
Okay, just a second, one at a time.
I don't think it was a facade at all. I think they came to the point in their mind where they were happy with what the decision was that they made. They had already made their decision at that point, and so now it's just carrying it through. And
Okay.
I was in high school, grade 10 or 11, and one of my best friends committed suicide. Died by suicide. And I saw him the night before he committed, or before he went through with it. And he was the happiest go lucky guy at the whole party. And he had just broken up with his girlfriend. Something happened. And yeah, I missed it. Didn't know.
Yeah.
But a lot of the reason is that I learned later is because they find a sense of hope that finally the pain's gonna be over. So they have like a moment of celebration, stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's my experience too. Let's me mention a little bit of language. We try to avoid the phrase "commit suicide" these days. Yeah, you caught yourself. So we tend to either talk about dying by suicide or just use the word suicide as a verb. They suicided. That's one of the preferred terminologies now. So that we're getting away from, commit sounds like a criminal act and has kind of a pejorative connotation. So that's where we try to find some other way to talk about it. But yeah, this has been my experience, and this is usually what we see in research is, up to that point, you're seeing a lot of this. There's a lot of wrestling going on, a lot of questioning, a lot of internal struggle. But when they've made that decision, especially if it's the case of somebody who's an elderly person who's lost their spouse of 50 years, hey, I'm going to be with them, dying and going to heaven. I'm going to be in there. We're going to be together in the arms of Jesus. Let's celebrate. So you can find that, or that the pain will be over. Thank God. Any other thoughts about these warning signs? And again, every person is an individual. So you can't say that all will be there. You can't say any will be there. But these are common experiences.
Interesting to know, though, that I thought most of the veterans who commit suicide had been deployed.
No.
Well, interesting.
No, and for a lot of them, it's a lot of these same issues. The relationships, the finances. Though there are some who do deploy and come back. I had one soldier who he had deployed probably 6 times with Special Forces units. But he was not a special forces soldier. He was a signal soldier. So he's in the unit, but he's wearing a maroon beret, not a green beret. So he'd come back from a deployment ready to go to his next military school so he could get promoted, and they'd say, no, we got to give that slot to one of the Green Berets. You have to go on another deployment. And then he's looking forward to getting out, and he comes back, and he gets a job as a greeter at Walmart. After that high-paced combat life. He comes back eager to see his wife, and his wife doesn't want to have sex with him. And at our Christmas party, he was sharing with some folks in his section about this, and they brought in the first sergeant, and they called me, and I'm on the phone finding out about another soldier who was killed that day when a car hit a deer, threw the deer across the road, and hit his car in the windshield. So I had my chaplain assistant talk with this one, but it seemed to me they were connecting him with resources. They were calling in the mental health folks. They were getting him what he needed. So I figured, okay, let me focus on this one. A week later, he was dead. And that was definitely combat related. That was in that inability to transition afterwards. So yeah, are there cases where we see this as a factor? Oh, definitely. Do they want to get rid of the pain of different traumas in war? Yeah, but more, especially the younger ones, it's and for military veteran suicides, the higher number are over the age of 50. So that includes some of us older veterans who are still have deployed in recent wars, as well as Vietnam vets or older. How many saw the movie Unbroken? About the Olympic athlete who was in the Japanese POW camp. When I read the book, one of the footnotes was that something like 70% of former POWs in Japanese prisoner of war camps died by suicide after they got home, because they just couldn't get over the trauma. So, okay, what do I got to do to get back to my video? That's what I'm going to do. So when we see these kinds of signs, what do we need to do?
Maybe, I don't know if you have your presentation, but what about pastoral suicide?
That's a reality. How many have here know of a pastor who died by suicide? We had one just this past fall down in Florida. One of the youth pastors. He was like 30-something years old. Leo Screven, evangelist. He had just done an evangelistic series at my church. Ed Bowen was one of our senior Army chaplains. He was a lieutenant colonel. He was the director of clinical pastoral education at San Antonio at Brooke Army Medical Center. Had influenced so many people in the military chaplaincy, especially military hospital chaplains. And wherever I go with more senior Army chaplains, they say, Seventh-day Adventist, pause. Did you know Ed Bowen? So, can pastors experience all these same feelings that we saw here? In a lot of these cases, in each of these cases, it came out that there was underlying depression, bipolar, similar related issues that some had been getting treated for, some struggled with. We'll talk a bit about that later, but mental health issues for clergy are critical, because when we're alone, who do we turn to?
You're always alone.
We're always alone. Especially in the Adventist church. I think the Adventist church has one of the groups of clergy that's lonelier than a lot of other denominations. Though, when I was supervising Catholic priests, a large proportion of them were alcoholic. That's how they dealt with their loneliness. Because there you're being told, hey, you have this indelible character. You have been ontologically changed by virtue of your ordination, and you are different from those people. Who do you have friends with? Who do you connect with in those situations?
You ran out of battery.
Oh, is that what it?
Yeah, it was not working, the top one.
Oh.
Need a second.
Okay, we need a second for it to, that was that. So when we see these signs, that's where we start with this code of ACE. We have to ask the questions. You know, you might just start a conversation. Hey, what's going on? How you doing? And you start hearing about some of these things, or you see these things. And you can ask about the meaning. You're sad, why? What's happened? You lost your job? What did that do for you? And you start that conversation and you pick up on maybe these themes of loss and hopelessness. And in that conversation, you have to ask that question, are you thinking about suicide? Not, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Because for some, it might not hurt at all. They're trying to put the pain away. Some people say, well, are you going to make it more at risk of suicide if you ask them about suicide? No, you're not going to put it in their heads. But by asking, and I've had people say, well, no, why would you think of that? Well, you know, you've told me about losses at jobs and work and relationships, your fear for the future, your loneliness, and sometimes people who are thinking about those things are thinking about suicide. And that's why I need to ask you that question. Are you thinking about it? And usually, oh, there we go.
The ACE again was ask,
care, escort. And so what happens, do you think, if you, yes, go ahead.
Just wondering, has anybody, when you ask the question, are you thinking about suicide, has anybody responded and said, yes, in a way, or?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's how that's how the conversation starts.
So they say yes.
Yeah. Often, sometimes they say no, and we talk about that, and we find out that there's a lot of things going on, but no, they're not thinking about suicide. And it's like, okay, well, then let's talk about the problems that you're facing and see what we can do about those. But if they say, yes, I am thinking about suicide, what can we do? Well, let's talk about suicide. And when you say that to somebody, when you say that, let's talk about suicide, what do you think that does for the person?
Helps them to feel heard.
Helps them to feel heard?
That someone understands the reality.
Huh? What else? Excuse me?
They begin to open up.
Yep, often. Something that's been just in their head, that they've been bouncing around in that echo chamber of the mind, now it's suddenly out there, and they're talking about it, and they've got somebody who says, it's okay to talk about it. Because there can be that sense of catharsis, that sense of liberation, that sense of, okay, maybe this is something manageable now if I can actually talk to somebody about it. So in my experience at that point, there's, don't give me, come on. There's usually a sense of freedom and almost a palpable, okay, let's go ahead and talk about this. Though often in a lot of the interventions that I do, since somebody has already surfaced the issue and brought them to me, we're starting at this point. Okay, you told Sergeant so-and-so you're thinking about suicide. So here's how that might progress. Hey, how was your trip? How was your weekend? Oh, you start hearing negative things. Well, you seem upset. What's worrying you? Can I help? Level 4, are you thinking about killing yourself? The next part is care. How do you show care for this person? It's really by being there present with them and listening. So some people will jump here and say, oh, well, how are you thinking about doing it? Well, if you are doing a risk assessment as a psychologist, you might want to get into that. And there could be a place for that in some techniques. But right now, you just want to continue the conversation and build the relationship and explore more. Let's talk about the things that led you to this. You've told me about your spouse leaving you. You've told me about you losing your job, and this is what's made you think about suicide. Tell me more about that. And that's when you practice a lot of your reflective listening skills. So that, what did that losing that job mean to you? How did you feel after it? So it made you feel sad, took away what gave you meaning and purpose in life. You're afraid, how can you support your family? So that kind of basic reflecting skills. Assuring them that you're there for them. You know, you don't want to start telling the stories. Oh yeah, my grandfather did, and this is how he did it. No, I don't know exactly how you feel, but you know, I do care, and I'm here for you. You know, use the active listening. Let me make sure I understand. Summarize it. Maybe on the phone, keeping them talking. So what you're doing in this phase is just building that relationship, strengthening it. And again, you're getting out all this stuff that the person has bottled up. And over the course of this conversation, which could be 10 minutes, could be 2 hours, you might see a change in tone. Again, that sense of relief that, hey, they're talking to somebody about it, and as they're hearing it bounce back, maybe some of these things seem a little bit manageable. Maybe they might see that there's some hope, or maybe they're just ambivalent. Okay, now I see part of me wants to live, part of me wants to die. And at that point we can ask, so what can we do now? And affirm that. Okay, there's part of you that really doesn't want to go through with this. You've mentioned significant relationships. You've mentioned doubts. You've wondered where God is in this. Can we see about getting you some help so that we have some space to keep you safe while we look at some answers to some of these questions? And that's when we go to the next part, escort, which is take them to help. We as pastors tend not to have degrees in therapy where we can do what needs to happen at that point. We can still be pastoral supports alongside of somebody, but that's where I'm taking them to mental health. That's where I may be taking them to the emergency room. That's where I've ridden in the back of an ambulance on the way to the emergency room. Maybe call 911. Maybe call crisis line so you have somebody else to talk to who might have more resources, more support. Here it says don't force them. That was a big issue in talking with some survivors of suicide at the suicidology conference that I was just at. A lot of young people who had multiple suicide attempts saying, you know, a lot of folks aren't really dealing with what are the underlying social justice issues that give hopelessness. What about the coercive nature of a lot of mental health? I'm going to take you and I'm going to throw you into a mental hospital for 2 weeks. One girl said, as her graduation weekend, she was sad. And she mentioned about her parents took her to the counselor, and she mentioned in the frustration, well, maybe suicide would be better than all the demands her parents were throwing on her. And she ends up being forcibly committed and not able to go to her college graduation because of this very coercive, forceful approach. And she came out just very angry at her family, angry at the therapist, angry at the hospital. And in my case, all that I've dealt with come to that point and say, yes, let's go together. Let's go for help. But that coercion piece is one that we aren't doing a good job of talking about as a mental health community. But go ahead.
I understand, well, that two-part question. I understand that if you call an ambulance for someone that is basically contemplating committing suicide or attempting suicide, that the ambulance can't take them if they don't want to go.
It depends. If they see a risk to life, right, they're going to do their own assessment. They're going to, in my experience, they're going to do their risk assessment, and if the police are there, if police are called, and if the police assess a threat, they'll take them to the mental health unit or the mental health intake. That's how it's going to happen more often where I live in my community.
So what happens in a situation where the individual just does not want help?
And they can say that, you know, they could present at that point just, you know, I'm fine. No, I'm not in crisis.
Or
yeah,
they're thinking about
or they are,
don't
but
want
yeah.
anything.
And unless a judge is going to make an order, and the Army, we can have somebody stay with them 24/7, and we will do that. But yeah, those cases show that there are limits to what you can do.
So would it be better to err on the side of caution, or, you know, in making sure they get help? And, you know, like the daughter, like you said, the daughter was angry.
Yeah.
What happens, you know, I'm sure the parents wouldn't have been able to live with themselves if something would have happened.
No. So what do you think?
Oh, no. I was going to present a different scenario that actually happened a couple months ago with a pastor friend of mine who was, they're in an isolated community type of situation, and the person actually started having suicidal thoughts, and they were going to drive into oncoming traffic. Like, it was a thought that I guess they had toyed with a lot. And then there came a point where the person was actually going to do it. So the person drove themselves to the hospital and checked themselves into the hospital. The hospital released the person that same night, but the person has no family support. So it was like, who are you releasing this person to? Because like the person, they saw the psychologist, and the psychologist was like, yeah, you're fine. Yeah, that's the job, is to present that you're fine. But if the person comes in and says, hey, I was going to drive into oncoming traffic, how are you releasing this person? Like,
yeah. And so what we try to do is come up with what kind of a plan for support do we have? Are there friends that can be called? Can they go over to a family member's house? I usually wear a suicide hotline number wristband, and so that I can give that to somebody in time of need. Connect them with their own physician, whatever. It's like, can we come up with a multiple list of supports for that person? But again, there's always the case where that person, if they're alone, if they're committed, can always make that decision. And it ends up being their decision.
well, can you refuse to leave? No.
Some have tried, and that just gets them the police called, and sometimes it does not end well after that.
So are there any services that can stay with a person who is having suicidal thoughts but doesn't have support in a city, or is there anything like that?
I haven't heard of anything like that.
Oh.
But here's where you might want to investigate your own community.
I don't know what the conversation with the person and the psychologist was. I don't think the psychologist was think that when he or she believes that this person's going to really commit suicide, I don't think they're going to let him go. But after the conversation, that maybe he thought that, okay, maybe it's just a temporary thing, that it will be okay, right? Fine. But if the psychologist thinks that this person is going to, when you walk out of the hospital and then commit suicide, then I don't think the person would have just discharged him.
And sometimes the psychologist, the nurse, the ER is so filled with patients, Let's just get this person out the door.
Because the psychologist, when this person went to the hospital, it was near the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And the psychologist was walking out, and the nurse stopped the psychologist to do the assessment.
Yeah.
And the psychologist came in, did the assessment. I was like, yeah, no, you seem to be fine. You know, you want to go home and get some rest and, you know, manage some stress. Here are a list of psychologists. Good night. That was what happened.
And that's where we've seen cases of veterans shooting themselves in the parking lot of a VA recently, one in the waiting room. He just got done talking to the patient advocate and said, well, basically, F this, no point in going on, and in front of the 100 and some other veterans waiting in that, and he'd just come out of an inpatient treatment program in another state, part of the state, and moved there, and so there shot himself in front of over 100 patients and family members in the waiting room of the Austin VA clinic. So those things do happen. And they raise a lot of questions about how well our communities actually are there. And what about the person who's in a rural area? Where it's going to take, even if you call 911, it's going to take an hour before they get out there. Northern Manitoba.
I have a young...
Central Manitoba, most of Manitoba.
I have a teen who actually right now she's in the psychiatric hold, and this is her 4th attempt.
Mm-hmm.
And each attempt has been getting more violent.
Mm.
The last time she took every single pill in the house and stabbed herself in the stomach, and this time I don't even know what she did because we've been here. And each time she gets committed, and then they set her up with a psychologist, and I don't know. At some point, it just doesn't work, and then we end up right back here. And this is a young girl. She just turned 15.
These are going to have to be some open-ended questions. For now, let me cover a few more things so that we get... So one of the big issues that we have to deal with, though, is the issue of stigma. That people don't talk about it, don't want to go to help. How many pastors want to say that they're depressed? How many pastors are going to talk to their ministerial director or the conference secretary about these kinds of issues? In the military, yeah, I'm going to lose my security clearance, my secret clearance is the feeling. I had one of my soldiers I sent home from deployment because he had a real major breakdown after finding on his iPhone some iCloud photos that he did not take, that his wife took, that she was sending to somebody else. And boy, he was a strong guy and mature leader, and then, oh man, he's rolling around in the sand in front of my CHU, just bawling. And sent him home, and he was on a medevac flight that landed at Andrews Air Force Base, together with 5 soldiers who'd been wounded in battle in Afghanistan, and he felt just so ashamed. And he gets greeted by the command sergeant, or the sergeant major of the Army, Ray Chandler. That's the senior enlisted soldier in the United States Army. Sergeant Major Chandler and his wife were there to greet the plane. And he noticed my soldier hanging back and started talking to him and got a sense of the shame and the loneliness and the stigma. And he started sharing his own story, how when he got back from his last deployment, he was so messed up he saw behavioral health every week for 2 years. And he says, he gave him his coin, gave him his personal cell phone number, got his, said he was going to be checking up on him, and just gave him that encouragement. My soldier wrote back immediately. As soon as he got on Facebook, he was sending me this message, just saying how wow it was that the senior leader in the Army got it. And I sent I looked up Sergeant Major Chandler's email and sent him a note. 15 minutes later, the senior NCO in the Pentagon is writing back to me, sharing more of his story and how he just saw so much of his mission to talk about it openly and diminish the stigma. In my trauma section, I talk about Romeo Dalaire. He was the commander of UN peacekeeping forces in Rwanda. Canadian general. He had several suicide attempts after he came back. And he started talking about them, and he was the assistant director then of personnel for the Canadian Armed Forces. And he told his own story, and that caused so many young soldiers. Some of the people in the defense office were very embarrassed and shocked and worried and nervous, but he got so much response from the ordinary soldiers. And he was in a position that based on his experiences, he was able to implement a lot of change. And then he became appointed to a senator by the prime minister after that. And he served as a senator for a couple of years. And he was in that position to help push through legislation to change the veteran services and the mental health services and what's available, and especially to decrease that stigma and show, hey, if it can happen to me, it can happen to anybody.
Back to the earlier point
Yeah.
of given them finding themselves that they will be heard,
Mm-hmm.
that someone will listen to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where we have, as pastors, a lot that we can do to diminish stigma. One is talking about it. When I've preached about suicide and given kind of a mini version of this, you can't believe the number of people who come up and start telling their stories of themselves or family members. I talk about my son who's had several hospitalizations for depression. He has autism spectrum disorder and schizoaffective disorder. And when I tell those stories, people talk to me about them. It opens up. When I talk about my wife's one brother who's gay and now is kind of in a transgender place, asking a lot of questions, and he's 60 years old and reevaluating, and I tell those stories. And telling stories and telling personal stories gives people permission to talk about it. That we can talk about these. You know, we didn't talk about things like this once upon a time. Yeah. And yet, how many Adventist pioneers dealt with their struggles of depression? How many had issues? George Vandeman, you know, he had a son who had bipolar, I believe it was. And when George was like 70, his son, who was like 37, stabbed him once. And he ended up in the hospital, nearly died. But George telling people about that story enabled others to tell that. I had a pastor who I never had any idea what was happening with his kids who were my age. And one had bipolar and had lots of hospitalizations, I found out later. And it was only later, after he retired, that he felt, hey, I need to start talking about these things so that other people can know that if we can't talk about it in the church, where can we talk about it? And can we talk about mental health? Can we talk about public health? We have this health message. What are we doing to talk about the whole person and to see that we as the church have answers? So, one and then two.
My concern is that the army will take care of its own.
Mm-hmm.
Will go to any extent to ensure that remedial work is done for members of the army.
Mm-hmm.
But I have discovered that the church shoots its wounded soldiers.
Yep.
It kills them. And so I am a little bit worried that the pastors, the leaders, do not really have that comfort zone where they can share their fears, share their concerns, be open and vulnerable. I am really concerned about that. And so while we're having this seminar, I think the leadership of the church, well, Elder Baker is here, so he represents him here. But I would want the church to take a more proactive approach and greater care, because while a pastor or an elder may have a mental breakdown and even attempt suicide, it doesn't mean that that person is outside the scope of redemption in terms of in the world.
Right.
And so we really need to help those individuals recognize that even though you have this problem, it can be overcome and you can be helped.
Yep. Yeah, and that's where telling just even our Adventist history stories. How many of the early leaders at one point just were burned out, crashed and burned, and a group of them all went off to Waukon, Iowa, and said, to heck with this, no more. And that's when Ellen goes off there, and she's in this sleigh going across the Mississippi while the ice is breaking up. The Dash to Waukon it was described in a book about George Butler. And I think it's Loughborough that she goes up to. What doest thou here, Elijah? And she reclaims those key pioneers and comes there as this healer, as this voice of grace. How much of our health message came from the treatments that James got when he was depressed, when he had a stroke? He was angry, he was lonely, he was bitter. And from that, so many treatments they went to trying to find help for him, they opened up her perspective of what our sanitariums could do. So, yeah, thanks. And
yeah, at least good here because David has a chaplaincy background. But in my experience, when you have a crisis in life, it's really sad. But if you have a package of crisis situations in your life, that's really terrible. Now, in my experience, I was really groping in the dark. And way back in my pastoral years, I had nobody to talk to. The only one I can talk to sometimes are ministers of other churches. But in the conference, they don't have resources. Not in this conference, it was in other conferences. Don't have resources. If you talk to people, to the administrators, what will be the result. They will tell you, well, you're having problem, then you should be out from the ministry. You're not fitted for the ministry anymore. There's no resources. I was struggling in my life for years and years.
Well, and that's where, and I'm not sure how it applies to Canada, but for NAD as a whole, under Adventist Risk Management, go to the Adventist Risk Management site and look up EAP. And if you're covered under the under the life insurance plan, ARM webpage says you're covered by the EAP, the Employee Assistance Program, and here's the resources for mental health that are available through Adventist Risk Management, through the network of support in the community. So that might be a good thing for you guys to look up and send that out to the pastors.
Our conference subscribes to the Kettering.
To the Kettering, okay.
So they, we can
so through the Kettering network.
Anytime they want.
Okay, great. So here's a good time to remember. Hey, did you know that you had the Kettering network that you could call into?
And there's also Adventist Risk covers counseling as well.
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact numbers now, but I think it's 50%. And how many sessions you get, I don't know the exact numbers. Is it 80%?
It's 80.
Yeah. And massage therapy and acupuncture and all kinds of
only 50.
Creative things. But hey, let me save some questions now, and let me continue through this because we got some other things that we do want to talk about. Local resources. Find out what your community has. Crisis Services Canada is a good webpage for you to look at, and the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention. So the one is crisisservicescanada.ca. The other is suicideprevention.ca. So those are two local things. And those web pages, here's the Crisis Services Canada. So you go to that, and you've got the toll-free 833 number that anybody can call. You can text from 4 p.m. to 12 a.m., so late afternoon and evening, texting. They have chat services throughout Canada. So you can publicize these kinds of things in the bulletin, in the local newspaper, wherever, so that people know, afraid to come to somebody in the church? Hey, here's the community resources that you can call anytime, text, what have you. Now, how many of you have schools? Or Pathfinders? Here's a great resource, Suicide in Schools, a practitioner's guide to multi-level prevention, assessment, intervention, and post-vention. It's got lots of free resources at that URL that come with it, assessment tools, safety plans for schools, what do you do, and a lot of this is applicable to churches as well. I looked on the risk management webpage to see if they had anything similar. They don't. American Association of Suicidology is a great resource, and they have accreditation courses on school suicide prevention and college and university suicide prevention. Resources for survivors, annual conference that I went to this year and was just blown away. It was a powerful experience. Special risks for youth, isolated kids, bullies, we can't forget about the adult leaders, families, suicide pacts between kids, between teenagers. Contagion is something that pretty much just happens among adolescents, where one after another, and you have a cluster in a community or in a school of people who've heard about it. So you want to have that proper postvention to start doing some counseling to kind of contain that. Have a crisis plan, have counselors. What do we have for, we talked about this at the 180 Symposium on Youth Ministry. We're talking about social issues, and I was part of a little working group of social workers and psychologists talking about mental health issues. Do our schools, do our conference education superintendents, do they have mental health counselors that they can call if they need intervention? Do they have somebody, whether it's on contract or referral, that if they have a situation in a school, that they can get somebody in to help that school and advise that? That was one of the things we talked about. It'd be nice if each conference education department could have a licensed clinician on staff. That costs money. More training opportunities. The programs that I teach are produced by Living Works, which is a Calgary-based company. It is the world's leader on suicide intervention training, and it's an evidence-based program that was developed at the School of Social Work at the University of Calgary. And the key program that I teach for them is ASSIST. It's a 2-day training, applied suicide intervention skills training. And that's where we go over a lot more of the theory, but also practicing the skills that are involved. Starting out first is kind of doing some group simulations, so nobody's put on the spot, but then working up to the point where everybody's practicing an intervention situation by the end of the second day. And it is a fun one to teach, and has really... One Army base made this mandatory. They had had the highest suicide rate. The commanding general made it mandatory for every soldier and civilian on post. They went to within 2 years having the lowest suicide rate in the Army. This is used by crisis line workers, so I've taught it for our community mental health agency, for their crisis line workers. I've taught this about 20 some odd times now, so I'm a master trainer in that. There's also a half-a-day version we teach called Safe Talk, which can be done in about 3 hours, and it covers the principles, but it's more for kind of the average congregation. And this being a Canadian program, there are trainers all over Canada, not just those of us far away. And they just came out with a program called START, which is a web-based learning program. For an individual license, it's $30, but the conference could talk to them about, hey, how can we purchase a bulk license for all of our pastors, all of our teachers? And this is a training that can be done in about an hour, and it's got web-based simulations where you're interacting, playing the role of the caregiver, working through different scenarios. So this just got released on May 23rd, last week. And
can we get those slides?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what I would recommend. I'm just giving you a little taste in about an hour and a half, but in the Army, we want to make sure every single chaplain has the ASSIST training. And I would encourage that every pastor and every teacher be trained in it. And you could talk to the local mental health folks and say, hey, do you have a grant that covers this? Do you have anybody that does grant writing? And often they will.
Yeah, we just sent 2 of our pastors off to get some suicide prevention trainings. But I mean, I wasn't aware of it.
Yeah. Postvention, what happens afterwards? Mental health first aid is another program you can take, which is an 8 hours training. You need to provide that to the survivors, mental health first aid. You got to engage the whole community and family in crisis intervention. Help the families with practical matters. Anybody knows what a trauma cleaner is? That's a specialized cleaning company that can clean up the mess after somebody has shot themselves in the head in their living room. So the family can come home. Or a body died of natural causes and has been there in that bed for a month before somebody found that elderly person. There are companies that's what they specialize in, cleaning after traumatic events. And I had to find that out and connect some survivors with those companies. And the wife, she came back to see me, and she had gotten the husband's computer back from the trauma cleaners and gave it to me so I could turn it into our signal section. In a school, how do we maintain the routines so that they can keep teaching? We can use that as an opportunity to do more suicide prevention and intervention. And in a school, we had 3 suicides of medical students at Loma Linda in one semester, about 1.5 years ago. At our schools, you're going to have memorial ceremonies for the whole community to come out and grieve. A lot of emotional responses, but especially there's the grief, but especially the guilt and the anger. Anger at the person, guilt and shame. Why couldn't I have done something? Look at the organization. Like with any crisis, do we have a team of people at a church or a school that could respond? Does the staff trained in critical incident stress management? We'll talk about that in a bit later. Suicide intervention, psychological first aid. We're really pushing the active shooter response stuff. Every conference in the U.S. has been having these active shooter trainings. Some I think go a little far, but how are we prepared for these tragedies? Rituals for the community. Things like prayer meetings, memorial service, funerals. How do we connect the Word of God at these times? For me, in my Army memorial ceremonies, in my funerals for suicides, I come back to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 2, chapter 4. Where it said that he had to become like his brethren in every respect so that he could be this faithful high priest, tempted in all points as we are, so that he could be merciful and compassionate. That's my theological response. We don't know what pain led somebody to make that choice of suicide. We don't know that mix of chemistry and psychology and biology and all that stuff that was going on. But the judge that they're going before is one who has their name written upon his hands. And he's the one who has suffered temptation. He's the one who has suffered doubt. He's the one who cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And he's the one into whose hands we can commit them. If our Adventist sanctuary message is not about that kind of hope, if it's instead something that makes us guilty and fearful, we're preaching it wrong. Because that's the whole point of the book of Hebrews, that we can have boldness to go before the throne of grace because Jesus understands the pain of the human heart. So that's, to answer that first early question, that's how I do it. And that's what, all right, look at the Psalms. How many of the Psalms talk of, and when I do ordinary teaching about prayer, people, oh, how do I pray? Look at the Psalms. Look at the things that David was able to take to God He's screaming at him. He's depressed. He's angry. He's throwing things at God, as it were. He's rejoicing with God. Sometimes all of that within 3 or 4 verses of the same psalm. I mean, just Psalm 22 starts in despair and ends in praise and up and down. And let people know, hey, God is okay. I love Fiddler on the Roof for that reason. Tevye just has this ongoing conversation, arguing with God all day long. But it's because he understands God is interested in all of his ruminations through the day. Self-care, and we'll get more into this as we go on. But as we're ministering in these situations, everything that we're telling others about stress and how to deal with stress is all happening to us too. So in that one where that senior leader of mine died, I had just done critical incident stress management training. And so I'm implementing that 2 days after I did the training with my 80 full-timers in my unit. And I had 2 days that I was with them, and then I crashed. And I reached out to my senior chaplains, I reached out to pastors, I saw my massage therapist, I walked to the beach, and I just disappeared for 2 days because then I knew I had to come back and be there for the funeral, for the memorial ceremony, and to deal with those soldiers that weekend at drill who were not there the previous week. It was in the midst of this that I saw, hey, I need to start seeing a counselor at the Veterans Clinic on a regular basis because I'm dealing with a super heavy load of this kind of trauma constantly, and I have to have somebody that I'm constantly dumping it on, or I'm going to go under. And I also, as a senior chaplain, have to be modeling that to other pastors, to other chaplains, that you cannot survive this, you cannot deal with these things if you are not being proactive in doing these things to take care of yourself. Again, I'm going to get into a lot more of this as we go on, but you too are going to have to vent, have to grieve, have to shout, have to cry, pray, and give God the praise. Oh.
Yeah, my comment previously was actually about this. Say, for the ministers, I don't know, I'm just telling about my experience before, that's years back. When I was in crisis situation, I have no avenue to have catharsis in my life, because there were no resources that time. I mean, not resources from outside, but from within the conference, to let off steam.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have friends, of course, yes, but it's a different thing that when you're struggling in your life, before it becomes, more acute, that you have, people to
yeah. We'll come back to this because I'm going to talk about that a lot more. So let's take a 10-minute break now.
Circle of Hope Network, doing life and being church together.